At noon on the 10th of April, 1912, crowds gathered here to watch the maiden voyage of the world's largest ship, RMS Titanic. She cruised down Southampton water on her maiden voyage to North America, but she would never arrive in New York. Even though it was a cold, overcast, windy day, these huge crowds had gathered to watch a piece of history. They were watching a monument to modernity, a sleek, modern, luxurious liner that was offering a safe, fast, comfortable way of crossing the Atlantic Ocean, an ocean in which, until so recently, had been fraught with danger and uncertainty. Titanic was said to be unsinkable. But just 5 days later, she was gone, swallowed up by the icy waters of the North Atlantic after striking an iceberg. It was one of the worst disasters in maritime history. Around 1,500 people were killed, and yet, bizarrely, it made her the most famous ship in history. I've always been fascinated by the myths around the Titanic, and I've always wanted to know exactly what is true, and I know just the man to ask. I get to meet a lot of historians, researchers and collectors doing this job, but I'm not sure I've ever met anyone quite like Tim Maltin. Titanic expert. He doesn't just research and write about the Edwardian period, he lives it. In his Edwardian garden, complete with his Edwardian tennis court, I think he's just turning up in his Edwardian wheels now. So this beauty is actually a contemporary of the Titanic.
That's absolutely right, Dan. This is a Wolseley, designed in 1910, and I like to think that, one could have driven this car down to meet the Titanic at Southampton.
The Titanic is a story we all think we know so well, but when you're looking at it as an expert, is it accurate?
Well, sadly not. We all know the main points about Titanic, but when I started reading and learning about the Titanic, what I found was that Captain Smith wasn't drunk, the rudder wasn't too small, the rivets actually weren't weak, they were just the weakest point in a very strong structure. And the more I looked into it, the more I thought, well, what really did cause this incredible disaster that we're still talking about today?
Right, well, hit me. What are some of the key myths you want to dispel? Let's start with the one I've heard of. The lookouts didn't have binoculars, so they couldn't see the iceberg coming.
I think, Dan, the reason why that myth is so persistent is because you are right, and it is true, that there were in fact no binoculars in the crow's nest that night. However, what we need to remember is that when you're looking for icebergs at night, the best way to detect them is with the naked eye. And that's because the naked eye has a wide field of vision, and that helps the way that we detect objects. Whereas if you're trying to look through binoculars, it's really hopeless, because the binoculars are used to inspect an object you've already detected, whereas the best way to detect them is with the naked eye. And funnily enough, had they had binoculars, it would have slowed them down, and they'd have spent longer before they rang the warning bell. Because instead of thinking, is that an iceberg or not, and checking it out with the binoculars, they just rang the bell 3 times, which meant iceberg dead ahead.
And what about all this stuff about being an unsinkable ship? Was it properly constructed and designed?
Titanic was one of the best built ships in history. She was so well built. I've been lucky enough to go and see a huge 40-ton piece of the Titanic, and just the scale of it and the size and the weight of it, it's utterly incredible. The reason why the White Star Line said it was unsinkable is that you could actually have sliced it into 3 pieces and each piece would have floated. She was also designed to float even with the first 4 watertight compartments flooded, and she was designed to float even with a collision at the point of 2 watertight compartments. But what she wasn't designed for is a kind of side-swipe disaster that did a little bit of damage along 200 feet of Titanic's length. And that, Dan, was 5 watertight compartments, and she could sail with the first 4 flooded, but not the 5th one. In fact, Dan, she sank on an even keel and it took her 2.5 hours to sink. Whereas if you think of the Costa Concordia, for example, recently, she rolled over much more quickly. So actually you could say Titanic's hull was safer than modern ships today.
You're going to tell me now that I'm wrong even about the sort of the famous profile of the Titanic lifting out of the water and sliding beneath the icy North Atlantic.
Sadly, Dan, even that is a myth. Titanic, as soon as she got about 15 degrees tipping up, because remember, the iceberg scored in the starboard side along the bow area. What that did is the water filled in at the front of the ship, and that meant that it dragged down like that. And rather like ice cube cells filling up with water, she just slowly sank at the head like that. But as soon as her 30,000-ton stern section was no longer supported by the water, she was then out of her design build envelope, and then the stern broke away at a very low level. But interestingly, because the stern was so well subdivided, it actually crashed back down, and people on the stern, which was almost everyone at that stage, they thought, we're going to be fine, we're going to survive. But sadly, as the submerged water-saturated bow kited down towards the seabed 2 miles below, she was trying to have a tug of war with the floating stern, and she did so much damage pulling at her keel that the damage to the stern that was caused by the bow was greater than the damage caused by the iceberg. So eventually the stern itself sank very quietly, and in fact we hear from one passenger they didn't even get his head wet as he swam off the stern.
So the rudder wasn't too small?
Well, interestingly about the rudder, Dan, the rudder on the Titanic was the same size as that of her sister ship, the Olympic. Now, the Olympic survived until 1935, but her wartime captain said that the Olympic, which had the same size rudder as the Titanic, was the best handling ship he ever had the pleasure to command. So much so that, in fact, the Olympic had the distinction in the First World War of being the only merchant ship to sink a U-boat. And he did this by, on the bridge of Olympic, seeing a U-boat, putting hard rudder and swerving, and actually rammed into the U-boat and got it that way.
As well as all the written records, we got all the photographs of Titanic as well.
Even though Titanic didn't last very long, we have a good photographic record of her.
I love this dockyard shot here. That's amazing, isn't it, all the activity?
So Titanic was built in Belfast at a shipyard called Harland and Wolff, who, as you can see, employed thousands and thousands of workers. And it's incredible here to see that almost all of this area of Belfast was employed on the ships. And in fact, this photograph is taken between the Olympic being launched and the Titanic. And that's why when you look at these giant Aral gantries in the background, which were a major landmark on the horizon of Belfast at the time, you can see the Titanic there on the left-hand side, and the Olympic has already just been launched, and the Olympic was painted white when she was launched, and that's how we know that is in fact an early shot of the Titanic.
Just an astonishing number of workers involved.
That's absolutely right, and they were only allowed 1 minute to go to the loo, and that's why the loos at Harland and Wolff are still today known as the minutes.
The minutes. What have we got? Is this both the two sisters side by side, I guess, or slightly later on?
A lot of people don't realise, when they think of the Titanic as the biggest ship in the world, they perhaps don't realise that she was the middle sister of a planned trio of ships. It was going to be the Olympic, the Titanic and the Gigantic. And what happened was that the Olympic was launched very successfully, and then she had an accident, in fact, where Captain Smith, who liked going very fast, he was trying to race a Royal Navy vessel out of Southampton called the HMS Hawk, and the huge power of Olympic sucked the Hawk into the side of Olympic, and her ram went through the hull of Olympic underwater, and Olympic started to fill with water, and magnets were automatically released, and the heavy doors slammed down, and Olympic was saved. And this is one of the reasons why people felt so safe on Olympic and Titanic. Olympic had damage to her propellers from that, and so she had to go into Belfast for emergency repairs. But Titanic was being completed in Belfast at the same time, and there was only one dock, the Thompson engraving dock, that was the largest in the world, and it was the only dock big enough to take these ships. So Titanic, her building had to be delayed, and this photograph here shows Titanic being warped out of her fitting out basin, and it shows the Olympic actually coming into that basin to take that space. And if that hadn't happened, Titanic would have sailed in March as planned, and there wouldn't have been any ice on the sea track.
So that collision caused that collision.
That's exactly right.
What about Captain Smith? What kind of character was he? Was he the right man for the job? And was he too desperate to break that record between Europe and America?
Well, with the hindsight that they crashed into an iceberg, of course you could argue they were indeed going too fast. But what we have to remember is that in 1912, in clear weather, in ice, every captain, and captain after captain testified this in the British inquiry, they would have done the same thing. The night the Titanic sank, it was actually extremely clear, and they were keeping a very sharp lookout. They knew they were getting into the ice region, but critically, Dan, they believed they could see the ice in time.
So he wasn't just whining and dining with the passengers. He was on the spot. He was in the right place.
Well, in fact, the captain did dine with the passengers at about 7 or 8 p.m. that night. But remember, Titanic didn't strike ice till 11:40, and people believed that maybe Captain Smith was drunk, or maybe he wasn't on the bridge. Now, in fact, Captain Smith was on the bridge the whole time. In fact, his suite of rooms, his navigating room and his sort of chaise longue area where he rests, and also his bedroom area, are actually part of the bridge. He was always on the bridge, and he had left instructions to be called immediately anything happened. And in fact, as soon as they went full astern and he heard the ship starting to stop, he came straight through and he was there. But he was working out positions, and he was alert and around the bridge the whole time.
There's the man himself. Is that Captain Smith there?
That's right, that's Captain Smith. He was soon to retire from the White Star Line. He was the Commodore of the White Star Line, and as such, he captained all of their flagship vessels. Now, the White Star Line, and because technology was growing so rapidly, every new ship they made was the biggest ship in the world. So, for example, he captained the Adriatic when she was the biggest ship. He captained the Olympic when she was the biggest ship. And then with Titanic coming along being the biggest ship, he was captaining her as well. But the thing is, although he could handle the biggest ships in the world, Titanic was almost twice the size of the Adriatic, so he was still on a steep learning curve. He was known as the millionaire's captain, and he looked like a traditional, gruff, typical North Atlantic captain, almost from the days of sail, but in fact, he spoke in a very quiet voice, never really above a conversational tone. But if he noticed something out of line, he would be able to bark out an order that would bring a man to his feet with a jump. And he was so popular with the crew that they loved sailing under him, and in fact, it used to make them flush with pride, the speed with which Captain Smith could con his ship into New York, and he would do it with feet to spare at either end, just swinging it in. He was very well liked, and he was very loved by his team.
And he was always going to go down with that ship.
That's right, because Captain Smith chose to help women and children get onto the lifeboats, and unfortunately, perhaps because he was an older man as well, the cold being -2 degrees, he would probably have gone unconscious within about 20 minutes.
What about the behaviour of people on board after the crash? I mean, stories of third-class passengers being locked below decks while the first-class guys all escaped.
I'm very glad you brought that up as well, because absolutely not. In fact, Dan, first-class stewards were sent straight down to the third class to tell people exactly where the boats were. The reason, tragically, why more third class died than first and second is not because they weren't allowed access to the boats. It's because, and I'll say this controversially, it's because they didn't want to get in them. And I'll tell you why they didn't want to get in them. It was women and children first. And in 1912, you were an adult male when you were 13. You could work down a mine, you were a proper adult. So you can imagine these women and men with families going to America. What you don't want to do is leave behind your 13-year-old son, your 14-year-old son, your 15-year-old daughter. So what they did is they decided they'd be better off sticking together. And the other thing about that, Dan, is they had everything with them on the Titanic. They were going for a new life in America. Many were poor immigrants going to America to find their fortunes. And when the breadwinner, if they were going to leave the breadwinner behind, dead in the icy waters of the Atlantic, what hope would there be for the mother on her own in New York before the welfare system? What hope would there be for those children? So the families of the third class actually elected to stay on the Titanic.
So there was no violent crowd control and people shooting one another?
Absolutely not. In fact, on the crowd control, you're partly right, because there were these berthen gates, and these were big iron gates that were drawn across the passengers to keep third class and second class and first class segregated. But the reason for that was because it was required by the US immigration authorities, because they wanted to stop the spread of infectious diseases. So the law was that no passenger ship could go to America without these gates shut. And it was only in a state of emergency that the gates were allowed to be open. opened. Now remember, it took them 47 minutes to work out that it was a state of emergency. So the minute they worked that out, they opened the gates. But of course, Titanic was stationary, she'd hit the iceberg, and there was that period of 47 minutes before it became a state of emergency, when indeed those gates were shut as they were legally required to be.
People always talk about there not being enough lifeboats on the Titanic.
Well, it's a brilliant question, because everyone says, oh, Titanic didn't have enough lifeboats. The fact is, if you want to have enough lifeboats on a ship for everyone, you need to have twice as many lifeboats as everyone needs, and I'll tell you why. Every ship almost settles on an uneven keel like that. It lists to the port or the starboard. And when it's listing, half of the lifeboats are put out of action. So if the Titanic needed 30 lifeboats, then she actually needed to carry 60 to allow for that eventuality. So what the Board of Trade decided was, instead of having ships piled high with lifeboats and becoming unstable, and most disasters not having the time to launch all those lifeboats, that what they wanted to do was have ships properly built and properly subdivided. And what the British authorities said was that any properly subdivided ships could actually carry a limited number of lifeboats in order for the lifeboats to act as a ferry from a stricken liner to get people to nearby vessels. And just on that point, let me say, people think of the wide Atlantic with little ships a long way away from each other. It wasn't like that, Dan. The Atlantic in 1912 was like a railway. It was like the Great Western Railway carrying on to New York. And what you had was, you had basically an up line and a down line across the Atlantic. And these lines were 60 miles apart to avoid collisions of the vessels going each way in fog. The point about this was that because the Titanic was right on her track, where she should be, and because the eventual rescue ship, the Carpathia, was right on her track, where she should be as well, they believed utterly that the lifeboats only had to ferry them to a nearby ship. Of course, the tragedy of that night was that the nearby ship, the Californian, did not wish to risk the lives of her own passengers and crew in the icy and very dangerous conditions that she found herself in, because Captain Lord of the Californian had actually nearly run into an ice barrier, and he'd actually come to a stop because he was at the ice barrier.
So have we found our true villain? Is this Captain Lord of the Californian? Is he to blame?
Well, Dan, wouldn't that be easy? But in history, you know, no one narrative tends to fit everything, because we like to create narratives after the event in our armchairs. But actually what really happened was, he thought this liner was coming to a stop, so he thought, I will signal her with the Morse lamp because she seems very near. Now, in fact, because of the very strange conditions caused by the ice, she was a lot further away than he thought. So although he was sending Morse lamp signals, and by the way, Titanic was Morsing back to him, but they couldn't read the Morse, because in the still air the night of the Titanic, because of the freezing ice everywhere, the air was slightly fluctuating and it scrambled the Morse lamp signals. So then they thought, well, let's get the radio out. But the Titanic, her radio operator was awake because she had two, but the Californian only had one radio operator. He'd been on a 16-hour shift and he'd gone to bed about, actually he was awake when the Titanic hit the iceberg, but by the time she sent a distress signal, he'd gone to bed. In fact, the distress signal was sent out into nothingness, and the eventual rescue ship, the Carpathia, only picked it up about it by ringing Titanic. She just randomly telephoned Titanic and said, you've got some mail waiting for you at Cape Race. And they came in incredulous and said, who's that? We're sinking, come in quickly. And he couldn't believe it.
You've got such minute knowledge about the Titanic. How do you work this out? How do you sift out the myth from the reality of what happened that night?
Well, Titanic is actually one of the best documented disasters in history, and there's a good reason for that. As soon as the disaster struck, it shocked the world because radio told the story before even the survivors had got back to New York. And waiting on the dock at New York was Senator Smith, who immediately ordered a full and detailed inquiry into the disaster. When the witnesses were giving their evidence, there was a stenographer there who was recording everything, and this volume here is all the evidence from the American inquiry and from the British inquiry. So the first thing to do to get to the truth of what really happened is listen to the people who were there. Now, it took me about 6 years to go through all this properly, but it is there for everyone to go through, and it's now online, so you can check out what anyone says against this document. So that's very important. What you also need is to read what people who were there actually said. And these are the 3 key books. So what we have here is, this is Lawrence Beasley. He was a maths teacher and he wrote this excellent book about the Titanic. He was interested in science, so it tells us a lot about the conditions that night. And then this one here is a first-class passenger, Colonel Archibald Grace, And this tells us a lot about what it was like in first class, and also he didn't get away in a lifeboat. He actually was swimming in the water and actually climbed into a lifeboat. So he tells us things about what it's like being sucked down by Titanic. He went down and down and down, and he thought that he was going to drown, but then just miraculously came up to the surface. And then the third and final really key one here is Lightoller's book. Now, Lightoller was the most senior surviving officer of the Titanic, and his book is quite detailed about what the officers were thinking and what was going on that night.
So from all this reading, what do you think really did cause the sinking of the Titanic?
Well, the remarkable thing is, Dan, that the sinking of the Titanic was caused by the weather. Now, when we think of the weather causing ship sinking, we think of huge storms. Well, the night the Titanic sank, it was the opposite. It was a perfectly calm night. And in fact, Titanic was sunk in a perfect storm of calm, because the water was so cold that it was causing the air to refract light differently. So it was refracting light downwards around the curvature of the Earth. So everyone knows about the hot desert mirage, where you're desperate for a drink of water and you think there's water there, but there isn't. Now that's because the light's bending upwards in the hot air, and it's bringing the sky onto the ground, and your brain is interpreting that as water, when of course it's not, it's sky on the ground. Whereas the exact same thing happens in reverse in an icy area, like where the Titanic sank. And what happens is, instead of the light bending upwards and bringing the sky down to the ground, the light bends downwards around the curvature of the Earth. So instead of the normal horizon of being able to see 7 miles or 12 miles or whatever it is, the night the Titanic sank, they could probably see about 80 miles. So you might think, as they did, that's great, we're going to see everything. But because they could see so much, they couldn't see the bergs, and that's because the depth of air they could see through was scattering light. And when light scatters off the molecules, it makes a silvery white haze, precisely the same colour as the iceberg they were looking out for.
So if it had been less icy cold, crystal clear, they might have seen that iceberg quicker.
That's absolutely right, Dan. Well, this is just so emotional, this image. What we can see here is this is actually taken from the last tender to leave Titanic before she went off on her own across the Atlantic on her ill-fated maiden voyage. And what you can actually see in this photograph is the smiling faces of the hopeful, expectant immigrants and families who are travelling to America for a new life, and they're waving goodbye to the tenders. They're having their last look at the green shores of Ireland. And of course, what none of them knows, and what we sadly know today, is that within 4 days of this photograph being taken, 1,500 of these poor souls have drowned in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic.
And then that's the Olympic there. That's what Titanic would have looked like when she was underway.
Visually, the Titanic differed slightly from the Olympic in that she had an enclosed promenade deck, and that stopped spray coming onto the passengers, which people had complained of on the Olympic. But what I think is interesting about this photograph, Dan, is that this was kind of taken, if you like, in the long Edwardian summer before the First World War. And this photograph is the pride of the White Star Line and the pride of Holland and Wolff, the best at the time shipbuilders in the world. And what they're showing is, they're showing that they can beat the Lusitania, they can beat the Mauretania, not in speed, but in size, luxury, comfort, efficiency, and regularity.
So not content with all these pictures of Titanic in your house, I believe you're making another one.
Well, that's right, Dan, because you may have spotted these photographs are all black and white. And what I like to do is actually bring Titanic to life. And at the moment, I'm working on a painting of Titanic in Ireland. And what you can do is you can see in the background the land behind her, and it's all historically accurate. And seeing Titanic set against the hills of Ireland just really makes her so much more real.
You're a man of many talents. Let's go and have a look. That's pretty good.
Well, I don't know, Dan. It still needs a lot of work, and you may have noticed that I haven't put a lot of detail in the sea yet, and that's because it's the hardest bit.
Well, listen, I meet a lot of historians, and I don't know any of them that can paint their subject as well as write about it. Well, what is it? I'm looking at that ship. It's obviously very beautiful, but what is it about this vessel and its sinking that has, consumed you and so many other people?
Well, Dan, I think the reason why I'm interested in it, but also why so many people are interested in Titanic still today, is that she's kind of the perfect tragedy in the sense that the ancients had the famous tragedians, and it was all about man's struggle against nature and the elements and the gods, as it were. And I think what Titanic shows us in a modern context is the best that man could do, the best ship, the best technology, the best of everything, and then she is just felled on her first voyage by what? A primeval block of ice. And I think there's something that speaks to the human condition about the fact that we can throw anything we like at nature, but at the end of the day, the universe is all powerful.
Well, Tim, that's a pretty good answer. I think you might have convinced me. I'm going to become a Titanic buff like you. Thank you so much for sharing your incredible enthusiasm and knowledge today.
My pleasure, Dan. Thanks very much indeed.
I'm going to let you get on with this sea.
All right, that's the hard bit. Thanks a lot, Dan. See you.
Hi folks, I'm Dan Snyder. I'm on a History Hit TV adventure in Antarctica. You should subscribe because we've got a lot more of this kind of thing coming up, including digs on the former battlefields of the Western Front. As subscribers, you can use the code YouTube to get 50% off your first 3 months.